This video is sponsored by Educational Linguistics, your new premier source for cutting-edge research on all things language and education. Welcome back, party people. Mike here with The Social Life of Language, and today we'll be covering an article that I wrote entitled Soft Linguistic Terrorism, 21st Century Re-articulations. I also created an audiobook version of the article read by yours truly. Link is at the top. As the title suggests, this is an update to Gloria Anzaldua's theory of linguistic terrorism that she developed back in the 1980s, which was a lens to analyze racist attacks on the linguistic practices of Latinos in the United States. Now, when Anzaldua was a child, teachers were allowed to hit students for speaking Spanish, and the pain and embarrassment were the point of such punishment. Now today, we're usually not allowed to hit children, so the disciplinary methods appear softer. But by soft, I don't necessarily mean that the new forms of linguistic terrorism are more gentle. Instead, I'm using the word soft similar to the way we use it in the phrase soft power. So what's soft power? A couple good examples of soft power might include the times when the United States refuses to enter a war directly, but instead we might try to undermine the enemy country by sharing our military intelligence with other countries. Or maybe we'll try to bankrupt the enemy country through economic leverage. Both of those examples are different versions of soft power, but importantly, whether we directly invade with troops or we indirectly attempt to bankrupt a country, the end goal is the same: to win the war. Now, in a similar sense, there are differences between direct methods of old school linguistic terrorism and the indirect methods of newer, softer linguistic terrorism. Clearly, we are not in the era where you could just physically strike children or tell them that they're stupid Mexicans. Times have changed and we're adapting with softer forms of racism. But the effects of soft terror are just as insidious, if not identical to the effects of old school linguistic terrorism. So what do these newer and updated forms of soft terror look like? Let's find out. So first, let's briefly review what Anzaldua meant by linguistic terrorism back in the 1980s. And I want to focus on one crucial aspect, and that is the realm of routine. It's really easy to think of terrorist acts as something spectacular or these events that are highly visible. But Anzaldua was also thinking of the stuff that you don't see, the stuff that fades into the background, the basic routine of life. In Anzaldua's Borderlands book, but a few pages before her famous chapter, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, Anzaldua described what she called intimate terrorism, or the experience of being a woman in a male-dominated society where women become tamed, where any little thing might result in a public shaming from a father, or perhaps a beating from an abusive husband. So here, Anzaldua was describing the constant and routine state of vulnerability, where punishment or the threat of punishment defines your reality. Eventually, this survival behavior becomes routine, meaning living in this state of terror was so routine, so ordinary, that you, as Anzaldua says, you drink it with your morning coffee. Similarly, the way intimate terrorism tamed Chicana women, linguistic terrorism was meant to tame the wild tongue. And the wild tongue stood for all linguistic practices that fell outside of white American linguistic norms, which to this day continues to be based on this idea, this fantasy of a standard or perfect or pure academic language. More specifically, this idealized English language monolingualism has been positioned as the norm in the United States. Now, while it might sound extreme to hit students in front of the class, Back then in the 60s and 70s, that was routine for Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States. Not too long ago, it was believed by many miseducated teachers that bilingualism caused cognitive deficiency. And that's a side keyword for this video, deficiency, or the idea that Mexicans are always lacking something. Things like parental guidance, or morality, or good hygiene, or intelligence, etc., etc. Mexicans and Mexican Americans were always perceived as deficient. Think about it. If your perfect linguistic ideal is based on the fantasy of a supposed perfect way to use language, that idealized perfection is impossible to reach because it doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a perfect or standard language user, and there's definitely no such thing as a perfect, standard, or pure language. I'll say it bluntly here. Standard language is a colonial white supremacist fantasy. I even made a whole video called Debunking Standard Language. I'll put the link in the upper corner. But to make a long story short, the enforcement of the standard perfect language fantasy is a crucial element to linguistic terrorism, especially because nowadays you aren't allowed to discriminate against entire groups of people, but it's totally okay to discriminate against how people use language. So Gloria Anzaldua developed linguistic terrorism theory in the borderlands of South Texas in the 1980s, where she attended Pan American College. Now flash forward to the 2020s, and I happen to be conducting research in the same South Texas region and at the same university, although nowadays it's called the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. While doing the research, something emerged that I thought was really important. I wanted to show that while the actual punishment techniques have mutated into softer forms, the actual effects of the newer, softer linguistic terrorism are virtually identical to the old school linguistic terrorism that Anzaldua spoke about. In fact, what we're gonna see in the video today is that there is not a clear break between old terror and new terror, but instead chains of effects that are connected over long periods of time. Sometimes those effects are linked across multiple generations. What I want to show then is that each moment of linguistic terrorism, whether old or new, each moment helps build and feed into the same trajectory of racial and linguistic trauma. In fact, we really only see an illusion of a break when we compare the oldest examples of linguistic terrorism from the 1980s to the newest examples in the 2020s. But what about all the stuff that happened in between? That's where you get to see how experiences of terror are linked to one another, even when separated by decades of time or generations of people. So let me prove it to you. Okay, for the rest of this video, for ease of use, I'm gonna switch to the terms old school terror when referring to Anzaldua's version of linguistic terrorism, and I'll use the term soft terror when referring to the updated version of the theory in this article. So let's start pulling these concepts apart by focusing on what I see as the main differences. Old school terror was usually or primarily based on punishment or the threat of punishment. On the other hand, soft terror works differently through two overlapping processes: ideological recruitment and incentivization. Let's break down these processes through the narrative found in subsection 3.2 of the article, which is titled The Multi-Generational Effects of Soft Linguistic Terrorism. So the other sections of the article look at soft terror in a university context. However, it's actually the narrative that I think is more important, because in this section you get to see linguistic terrorism spanning 3 generations. And it's also super easy to see how old school terror and soft terror are actually linked together, especially if we keep in mind the end goal of old linguistic terrorism, which included the enforcement of white behavioral norms, specifically English language monolingualism. And remember, they both feed into that same trajectory of racial and linguistic trauma. Okay, enough abstract talk. Let's look at some concrete examples. Let's talk about my experience with linguistic terrorism. So I was also born in South Texas and I graduated from the same university as Anzaldua. However, my experience with linguistic terrorism began before I was even born. My mom also grew up in South Texas and also attended this same university. When growing up, my mother experienced abusive white teachers who would hit students for speaking Spanish in school. That is a literal textbook example of old terror. Now, my mother's experience with old terror would eventually come to have effects on her son decades later. Now, parents from my mom's generation were often terrified that their children would also be abused in school for speaking Spanish. So when I was born, my mom decided to create an English monolingual household. Now, depending on how you look at this, it might appear to be a choice. But to Mexican parents back in those days, that decision was about survival, not choice, meaning the creation of my English monolingual household was a direct effect of old school terrorism. Only that effect emerged decades after the old school terror my mom experienced, which now links my experience with soft terror to her experience with old terror. The effect, or the result, if you want to call it that, was that I was socialized into white American English monolingual norms. And because I was raised within those norms, you could say that I was ideologically recruited to believe that these white norms were in fact the norms for everyone. Now remember, ideological recruitment is one of the two key processes of soft terror. Notice how no one is hitting me for speaking Spanish. Instead, my mom helped create the conditions where I would very likely adopt or be recruited to adopt those ideological norms all by myself. In the article, I say that ideological recruitment is a form of enforcement based on the appearance of consent. But what does that mean, that phrase, the appearance of consent? I've actually already mentioned a couple examples, but let's backtrack just a bit and clarify what I mean. For example, it could appear as though my mom willingly consented to creating an English-dominant household. But we gotta remember that decisions made under duress or consent granted under duress is not really a free choice. And like I said, my mom made these decisions out of a survival mentality, not free consent. But now let's think about childhood Mike, where he appears as though he willingly took up white behavioral norms, specifically English monolingualism. But again, if we really think about this, I didn't question my English language monolingual household because I was a kid and I didn't know any better. So again, the ideological recruitment appeared consensual. So in my school experience, no one was beating the Spanish out of me. Instead, I was rewarded for not being bilingual. In fact, my English was often perceived as so good that I was fast-tracked into gifted and talented programs. And this is the second process of soft terror, incentivization, or the offering of reward as opposed to punishment. And make no mistake, it is often these incentives that motivates folks to accept particular ideologies. So now we got both processes, ideological recruitment and incentivization. The story doesn't end there. I must include my own complicity as an agent of soft terror. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up not speaking Spanish and was rewarded for it in many different ways. And so as a brand new 21-year-old high school teacher in South Texas, teaching a 99% Mexican and Mexican American population, there were many times that I advised students to prioritize their English because it's the language of power. I told them many times that if they learned English, they they'd get into better colleges and they'd get better jobs. In other words, I was incentivizing English learning through potential rewards. I also made it appear that if they didn't learn English, they would never graduate high school, never find a job, never go to college. I was essentially creating this image of a Spanish-speaking homeless dystopia where the only thing to eat is bean tacos and cheap Mexican beer. So together, the threat of not graduating high school, paired with the supposed never-ending rewards of English, this was my way of attempting to ideologically recruit students via incentives into believing that English monolingualism was the norm, was the right way to be an American citizen. So quick side note here. I imagine that I am not the only educator that was led astray or miseducated or socialized into white norms and then tried to enforce those norms onto racialized populations. All I'm going to say here is acknowledge mistakes were made, give yourself some grace, and move forward, do better. End of side note. Okay, a couple more things before we go. Let's zoom out and note that there are 3 generations of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, all linked by a common experience of linguistic terrorism. You got my mom, her son, and then her son's students. 3 generations. All of my former students would be well into adulthood by now. But I have to wonder how many I successfully ideologically recruited into adopting white behavioral norms, specifically English monolingualism. And I also have to wonder how many of those students will continue the legacy of soft terror onto a 4th generation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Perhaps it'll continue with their children or maybe their students if they become teachers or whatever. And because the terror is spread across so many generations, not only does it appear softer, but in a very real way, soft linguistic terrorism can also be extremely slow to experience. In fact, I had a lot of trouble deciding whether I should call this soft terror or slow terror. And the rest of the article applies soft terror theory to a higher education context, which I think you'll notice looks completely different again. But the principal processes of soft terror are still there. But importantly, soft terror theory does not depend on human intentions, on whether or not someone intends to act in a racist manner. Instead, soft terrorism theory is designed to focus on institutional processes, as well as uncovering those linked chains of effects. To me, in my opinion, there is little value in hunting down the real racists, because the responsibility, if we can even call it that, the responsibility for the racist effects are spread across a whole lot of people and institutions. For example, my mom creating an English-dominant household was an effect of old terror that she experienced, and not something that she did because she was being xenophobic or racist. Similarly, when I became complicit in soft terror as a high school teacher, my intention was to offer my students a chance for a better life in American society. And at the time, I believed that adopting white norms was required because I had already been ideologically recruited to believe such a thing. And on top of that, my experience of being constantly rewarded for English speaking also played a factor in that. Unfortunately, my good intentions were beside the point. The enforcement and glorification of white norms happened, whether I intended that or not, whether my mom intended that or not. As I say in the article, soft terror is not about aggressive subjugation, but the constitution of a particular reality based on racializing ideological assumptions. So this is just a reminder that stuff like care and love and empathy and good intentions cannot, or rather do not, operate outside of power relations. Indeed, the effects of soft terror are often most effective when wrapped in the camouflage of good intentions. The multi-generational narrative that I just told really focuses on human actors. The teachers who hit children, my mom, me as a gifted and talented child, and finally again as a high school teacher. But if soft linguistic terrorism focuses on processes and linking chains of effects, then soft terror theory can also be used to link chains of effects from non-human actors, like institutions or education policy or language policy. For example, English-only laws that stigmatize non-English languages? Yeah, that's an example of linguistic terrorism. Like I mentioned, the rest of the article takes us into a higher education context, and you get to see soft terror in action there. Only it's extra complicated. But again, ultimately, it's about enforcing white behavioral norms as the unquestioned definition of what is normal, whether it's through the violent punishment of old terror or the ideological recruitment and incentivization of soft terror. The effects and envisioned end goal are the same. Deprioritize your home culture, your home language, and prioritize white American behavioral norms. And finally, there is a major twist in the article. When Gloria Anzaldua attended that college, the same university in this article, back then, Mexican students were lined up and forced to speak out loud to an administrator or a faculty member. And they were almost all promptly tracked into remedial speech classes meant to fix their accent. That's some old school terror for sure. But flash forward to today, and this university is one of the first in the whole United States to openly, officially identify as an English-Spanish bilingual university. That's huge. That's gotta be progress, right? Right? I mean, Spanish isn't part of white American behavioral norms, right? So isn't it time to celebrate? Well, as a bit of foreshadowing, I can tell you that the very last line of this article says, claiming to value a people's language while simultaneously devaluing the people who use it might be one of the softest forms of linguistic terrorism to date. Well, that's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and do donate to the Patreon. You can download all my articles directly from maestromikemena.com or academia.edu. Once again, I'm Mike with The Social Life of Language, and we're done.